Welcome back to Perf Damage.
Welcome.
This is the show where we examine the hidden histories of Hollywood.
That's right. And talk about film restoration, which is sort of kind of what we're going to talk about today. A little bit, in a roundabout way.
Well, you know, an important aspect of film restoration anyway.
That's right. Determining the aspect ratio, the correct aspect ratio of a film. That's kind of what we're talking about today.
And I know what you're saying, because things are so set now. The aspect ratios are so standardized, right?
Really? Because I thought what you were going to say was boring. It's easier to know what they are now.
Right.
But for older films, it's sometimes very hard to figure out what that is. And I know we've talked about that before. Longtime listeners are rolling their eyes. Yeah, you guys talk about that a lot. We do. That's because it's hard to figure out sometimes, especially for movies between 53 to 55, sometimes a little bit before, after, in that time period.
Yeah, that's when the studios were transitioning into widescreen for the first time. But you don't have to take our word for it.
You don't have to take my word for it. But you don't have to take my word for it. But you don't have to take my word for it, or Egbert's either.
So we decided to go to the source of info on widescreen, the 3D Film Archive.
Right, because
the 3D Film Archive website became kind of a secret tool in the restoration business here in Hollywood.
Yes. Everyone was using it as a resource. Everybody knew of this website. Bob Furmanek became sort of this industry legend. There were all these notes in the archive. The aspect ratio is 1:66 per 3D archive, widescreen.com, whatever the website was. We'll have it up. I can't remember what it is now. It's changed since then, but we'll have the link for that. But so I knew of Bob before I ever met him, because he was just this legend for having done all this research. And not only that, having shared all this research, which not everybody does, right?
Right.
A lot of people will do research and then kind of hold it close. But he was sharing it just with anybody on this website. So,
right. And as we learned, Bob is a super nice guy.
He's a very nice guy.
And he's a delight to have a conversation with.
He is. So he's recently restored a couple films for the 3D archive, and he's also had some run-ins with questionable aspect ratios, ones that the documentation may have said one thing or another, and then while he was restoring it, he questioned if the documentation was correct or not, just from looking at it. So He's had a couple issues like that. I've also had a couple issues like that recently. So we thought, let's get Bob on. Let's have a conversation about this. Let's see where it goes.
Yeah. And you're going to talk about like, what are the indicators and, kind of go step by step and how you guys kind of unravel these mysteries.
That's right. And Bob said, well, if you're going to have me on, I want to bring Jack Theakston with me, because Jack also helped do a lot of the research for the website. So Jack is a union projectionist in New York City. So he also brings with him a projectionist viewpoint. So that was actually really interesting.
Yeah, we learned a lot.
Yeah, and we also have an exclusive sneak peek at a new restoration that the 3D Archive is doing right now of the film Money from Home. They have given us a clip to premiere here. So that will be coming up at the end of our conversation. So stick around for that.
Absolutely. And if you get bored, fast forward to it.
Don't do that. Don't do that. So we'll get into all of that and more.
Yes, with both Bob Furmanek and Jack Theakston.
That's right.
Stay tuned.
And we'll even explain it in a way that Adam can understand.
Oh, no, not again. Hey, movie lovers. I'm Adam.
And I'm Charlotte.
And welcome to Perf Damage.
We're a movie-obsessed husband and wife team who work in the film industry. I oversee film restoration at the oldest studio in Hollywood.
And I bring the inside track from film development and production. And we love to explore the hidden tales of movies past and present.
So join us for a cinematic journey like no other.
From classic gems to examining the art of the double feature. This is Perf Damage.
popcorn popped, wine at the ready. Let's press play. All right, so we are going to chat about aspect ratios. And to do that, we have invited a couple special guests with us today. And we have, you want to do the introductions?
Sure. We have Bob Furmanek. He's the head of the 3D Film Archive. And also joining us is Jack Theakston. He is a co-producer at the 3D Film Archive, and he's been a union projectionist in New York for a very, very long time.
All right, guys, welcome to Perf Damage.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right.
All right. So what should we chat about first?
Well, let's talk about the genesis of your aspect ratio website that you have that has become like a tool that most of the people in the studios use for older films.
Yeah. So tell us about that.
Yeah. How did that come about?
Basically, what happened when I began this crazy 3D research journey way back in the 1970s, there wasn't much information out there. And what very little information you could find about 3D in the books was very short, not very complimentary. And I realized that if I was going to really learn what happened, I was going to have to go to the source. And that meant going to the trade journals that were extremely prevalent in the early 1950s. And I began building up a collection. And over a course of a few decades, I literally had assembled hundreds of magazines, things like Box Office, Motion Picture Herald, Exhibitor, Variety, Independent Film Journal, you name it. And I had assembled all that stuff for the 3D information. Well, as luck would have it, the whole widescreen development was happening at the same time. And that's when Jack Theakston entered the picture. And Jack, do you want to tell the folks what began your journey into this research?
Well, I started off as in movie theaters, projecting and that sort of stuff. So some of the knowledge started there as just common knowledge. And we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s. So you're basically set between flat and scope. That's your two flavors, flat 185 and scope 239. And at that time, DVD had come in as a prevalent home video format. And it was becoming very obvious because of the NTSC change over the airwaves that television was going to end up becoming widescreen. And it already was to a certain point. And then that's when you started seeing DVDs that were letterboxed. I know that goes back to Laserdisc in the 80s and 90s, but a common way that they distributed this stuff was, a full screen edition and then a widescreen edition. And having projected films, I knew what film looked like when it was open matte. In other words, for the viewers who don't know, flat widescreen is essentially the 4:3 Academy image, and you slice the top and bottom off and blow it up to a widescreen image. And that was done historically out of necessity. But because of that, when they did television broadcasts of these films or VHS editions of these films, they would just show it open matte with the top and bottom exposed. And, in a lot of cases, that just meant some extra headroom and things like that. But in the most drastic instances, you'd see things like boom mics and the top of sets and all this stuff that you weren't ever supposed to see. I think probably like the premier example of this that I always point to is if you watch the old VHS of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and there's this gag where he's pulling a seemingly endless chain out of his bicycle. And if you watch the open matte version, you can see the chains being fed through the bottom of this box that it's coming out of. And Tim Burton has said as much. He said, I hated when you saw that because you weren't supposed to see that. You were supposed to get that cropped off so that you got that sort of magical joke. And it just turned into this sort of surreal moment in the film. So I was interested in knowing more about specifically older films because I'd see ads for these films that they say on our wide vision screen. And here I am, I'm watching a VHS of it, and it's open mat. And so Bob and I had been talking about this for a while, specifically because we were doing theatrical presentations of classic films in 35 millimeter. We wanted to do it right. During 1953, all the studios decided to go widescreen, and that meant CinemaScope and VistaVision, but also flat widescreen and compositions being made for flat widescreen image and presentation. And VistaVision came about specifically because of flat widescreen. They needed a negative that would produce an optical reduction print that would look good blown up on a big screen. So if there was no flat widescreen, there'd be no VistaVision likely.
Well, and one of the things that got lost over the decades, when these films were new and sent to theaters, there were a lot of trade journals that were sent out to theaters. Among them, you had Box Office Magazine, and when they would review the films, beginning in early 1954, they would always list aspect ratios. And they'd be all over the map. I mean, in this particular issue, it's ranging from standard ratio to 166 to 255 to 1. So you had Box Office doing that. You had Exhibitor, which was another really valuable tool for sending theater owners the intended aspect ratio. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes the press books for movies would include the data. And here's a press book for Paramount's first widescreen film, Those Redheads from Seattle. And there's a very detailed little box in here that gives you the information about not just the presentation format for the film being 166 to 1, but the stereo sound interlock as well. So you had a number of written resources that theater owners would get. And perhaps the most significant, when the films were shipped to theaters on these 2,000-foot reels, which held about 18 minutes of film, they originally had reel bands that would identify the title, the reel number. This happens to be an Elvis film from 1962 and a Paramount film. The aspect ratio, intended projection ratio, would be stamped on the reel band. It's not on this particular reel because by 1962, 185 to 1 was really the standard. So there was no reason to put that information on there. But that information was all available for any theater showing the film first run. By the 1970s and 80s, when these prints were now getting booked into repertory theaters, and I grew up in New York, so I went to places like the Thalia and the Regency and the 8th Street Playhouse. These original reel bands were long gone, and the trade magazines were not, there was no internet, so you couldn't just go online and look at Variety and get that data. More often than not, the people at the studios in that period were not there in the 50s, so they didn't know. When we've gone through some studio databases, we've seen that there was precious little information about exhibition ratio. They might have what ratio is on the negative, but as Jack said, these were all shot full frame or open matte. So the information simply wasn't there. And I can't tell you how many times I saw films that were composed for widescreen shown open matte. And that includes things like Dial M for Murder and Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I remember going to a screening of North by Northwest at the Regency where they showed it full frame. I mean, you could see not only boom mics, but, the top of the set when they're on Mount Rushmore and you've got,
Right.
Klieg lights and everything. And the audience was laughing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
looking at VistaVision negatives, we constantly see the tops of the set. Boom mics are always, into the shots and stuff like that. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
So during this time, didn't they have framing trees though that kind of went out too? Like with
Yeah, that would be kind of stamped into the negative.
Yeah, at the beginning.
That was a Paramount thing.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't think any of the other studios picked up on that, and it's really a great idea. Paramount used it on all their VistaVision titles, but they also used it on some of their flat titles too. Like I remember the Space Children and Don't Give Up the Ship.
On Space Children.
Those are two. Yeah, they have the tree scribed into it, and it's a genius thing. They should have kept up with that.
Do you want to describe for the viewer what a framing tree actually is?
Sure. I think most viewers that have gone to 35 millimeter shows might be aware of changeover cues, which are the little black dots that show up in the upper right-hand corner. That's
thanks to Fight Club. I think most people didn't know about
Fight Club. Yeah, they're not cigarette burns, by the way.
Yeah.
We never called them that. Don't hold a lit cigarette up next to a piece of nitrate film.
Yeah, never do that.
But those are for me to know when to turn on the second projector and to actually do the changeover. So there's actually two of those sets of cues. The framing tree was a Paramount invention, and it was really genius, and I wish it had caught on. And it's in the same corner as the changeover cue, I believe. It's either on the top left or top right.
It's the top right.
Top right, near where the changeover cue was. So lazy projectionists like me don't have to move our eyes that much. And it looks like a backwards F with an extra line coming out the other side. And what's great about that is depending on the aspect ratio of your screen, and from theater to theater, that could change. That could be anywhere from 1:6:6 to 1:8:5 to 2:1. You would take the line and match it up to the top of the frame, and you knew that you would be in frame by using this tree. And framing is literally racking a knob that moves the image up and down. And since you got all this playroom up and down, if you rack it too low, then you see stuff you're not supposed to see. If you rack it too high, you start clipping heads and that sort of thing. This framing tree made it foolproof.
So this brings up that time period when all of the studios were jumping over into widescreen, but they didn't know all the studio or all the exhibitors hadn't changed over into that format yet. So they would actually shoot films to be shown in multiple aspect ratios, right? I know they have a recommended aspect ratio, but they made them safe to show in multiple aspect ratios.
Yeah, that's essentially still known today as compose and protect. You compose for a certain aspect ratio, but you protect it in case, for whatever reason, you're going to be seeing more image. And what a lot of theaters ended up doing in their installations was the best installations for widescreen are really what we call common height. The height stays the same, but we get wider until you reach that CinemaScope, the widest screen. And then you bring in the masking for 1:8:5 or anything below that. You have side masking. But what a lot of places did, because they wanted to capitalize on the biggest screen that they could get, was they would install screens that were an aspect ratio of 2:1. And so for CinemaScope films, they would close in top and bottom masking, so you'd get the widest image on that. And for 1:8:5, they'd bring it in on the side, so you'd get the tallest image for 1:8:5.
One of the things that we discovered in really doing this research, and to do it precisely, you had to go day by day. And thankfully, there were daily trade journals that you could get, updates as they were happening. Pretty much all the studios converted to widescreen cinematography. And, again, the practice was protect for standard, but compose for wide. So you had all the different ratios that nobody was on the same page. They were all doing their own thing. And the major theaters, the big theaters like the RKOs and the Lowe's theaters, they all started installing widescreens in the summer of 1953. So by time CinemaScope hit in September, a good amount of the major theaters around the country had already gone widescreen. Where it gets very tricky and complicated is at that point in the spring of 1953, when the decisions were made across the board. I think Republic was the last studio to hold out because a lot of their theaters were the mom and pop small town theaters. But even they converted in the fall. But the the decision was, okay, we're going to go for this new ratio. There was a backlog of about 200 standard ratio films that had been shot prior to that transition point. And a lot of those films wound up getting shown widescreen in the summer and fall of 53. Things like Shane and War of the Worlds. But what's most important, we found in getting to the accurate information of what the filmmaker intended, was to look at what the studio's policy was at the time of production and what their ratio was. And once you determine that, it's still not a completely clean cut across the board because, as Jack mentioned, and Universal's a good example, they went with 185 initially in April 1953. And then they shut down the studio for the entire month of May to retool all the departments to compose for widescreen cinematography. They started production back up in June, but then they're kind of alternating between 2-to-1 on some films and 185 on others.
Primarily the color stuff versus the black and white stuff.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure. We've gone through some of the production files, at the studio for Universal. We never really found a definite answer on that. And a good example is a film that we've just finished restoring. It'll be our next 3D Blu-ray release through Kino Lorber, and that's The Glass Web, a wonderful 3D film directed by Jack Arnold. All of the documentation when that film was released in late 1953 said 2-to-1 was the ratio. So we began our restoration work, and we were working from left-right scans of the camera negatives, and they're all full frame open matte. And we applied a 2-to-1 center crop to the master image. And it worked great for the opening titles. You start getting into the body of the film, and all of a sudden, on all the medium shots, everyone's head's getting clipped. And you're looking at it and it's saying, that doesn't look right. Long shots, you're fine. Medium shots, you're getting clipped. Close-ups are very, very tight. So I said to Greg Kintz, our technical director, I said, let's pull it back to 185 and see what happens. He did, and it all fell into place beautifully. And at a point like that, you have to say, okay, this is what the documentation said. This is what the trades printed. But clearly the DP was composing for 185. I mean, you're looking at the camera movement. You're looking how they're tilting the shots to match the action. And
that's always the dead giveaway, is when the camera starts following somebody vertically. I mean, if it's a 137 film, there's no need. You hit the top of the frame, you hit the top of the frame. But somebody stands up, and then, the camera has to follow them up.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's one thing we always find funny when people are debating aspect ratios, like saying that something is incorrect online. They always put a still. And that makes us laugh because, when I know, a still doesn't really tell the story. You can take a still from anywhere and sure, maybe that looks right or that looks okay, but it's really about the movement and seeing it in motion that really tells the story.
Sure, and also, it's one shot. Who cares? It could be a bad shot, That happens all the time. You got to look at the body of the film as a total.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's really, to do it as accurately as you can, it's a multi-step process. You go by what the research shows you, and then it's essential. And Charlotte, you can certainly speak to this. You've got to work from, full frame open matte scans that are giving you the full width of that image on the negative. We had many cases where we were handed a digital master to work from, and whoever scanned it decided, oh, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this, and clips the sides. And then you try to go to mat it to what the intended ratio is supposed to be, and nothing's working. You go back and get new scans that are fully exposing what's on that negative. and then all of a sudden it falls into place.
Yeah, that's why we always make sure we look at open matte scans originally. So we always know going into a project when it's been framed what it looked like with the whole image, just so we know, just to make sure that nothing's been lost.
You had
I mean,
that with The Country Girl, right?
Hmm.
Bing Crosby film. Now, what did you
Yeah.
find on that particular title?
Well, that one we had originally framed it at 185 because, again, all the documentation was sort of pointing us towards a 185 framing. And we went in and everything just felt wrong. We were thinking, who would compose shots to look this way? People, there'd be 3 people in a shot, one person sitting, one person standing, and someone's head is
someone's
kind
head's
of
like
cut
here.
off, and
Yeah.
the other person's chin's at the bottom of the frame. Nobody would frame a shot this way. No DP would do that. You put it in 166 and all of a sudden everybody's composed properly. And when
Falls
the
into
camera
place.
moves, so again, that's one of those times where you just go with, it could have been either way. The studio documentation isn't explicitly clear on what the aspect ratio would have been, but just looking at it, there's no way we could have done 185 and felt like this is correct.
One of the things, and I don't think we got into this story. So Jack, maybe you could talk about the work that you started doing, because you really, I think we're going back to around 2003 or 4 with like A Hard Day's Night and Magnificent Obsession, and some of the findings that you uncovered, and then the opposition that we remember all that stuff at the Criterion board. Oh my God.
Well, again, this goes back to when DVDs were editions that were coming out with widescreen. And about that same time that I was doing the research, there were a number of, sort of high profile releases that were coming out that it was clear that the studios that were going to put them out were putting them out in the wrong aspect ratio. And actually, my intention was to reach out to them directly. In a lot of cases, I did. And they revamped what they were going to do with that stuff. But in cases where I couldn't get in touch with them, I'd put it out there and say on the internet, hey, listen, if somebody's reading, this really should be da-da-da. And Magnificent Obsession from Universal was one of those. Criterion was putting it out, and I think initially their offering was going to be Academy ratio. And if I recall correctly, that's a 2-to-1 film. So the amount of headroom and unnecessary image on that master really would have looked comical. But the problem is a lot of the people that are sort of these armchair historians about this stuff, they grew up in a time where that's all they knew. They only saw it Academy ratio. They saw it on television, or they saw it on 16 millimeter, or they saw it at the Thalia Run Open Mat. They don't know any better. It makes them feel uncomfortable. The fear of missing out on something makes them feel uncomfortable without having the technical knowledge that this is how it's supposed to be presented. And they'll always point to cases of, well, what about this film or what about that film? There's a handful of titles. Bob mentioned before there was a backlog of films in 1953 that were incorrectly shown widescreen. We know that. The only other cases are foreign films in countries that had non-standard aspect ratios or were still in the Academy ratio period. Regional films where the filmmakers didn't know better and they shot it that way. I mean, Night of the Living Dead's like a classic example of that. It's a 137 film because they were using television cameras to shoot it, basically. Television film cameras that weren't marked off for 185. So what do? You have to run it, 137. But any studio film, once a studio makes an edict like that, it comes from the top down. Every department has to prepare for that. It's not just the camera department. It's the greenery department, the set department, the lighting department, the editing department. All of these departments, they got to get in line on this one thing. The studio says, hey, we're shooting for 166. It's going to be 166. There's no maverick that's there going, I'll show them. That was the that you'd be fired the next day, even if you were Orson Welles. And that was another film like Touch of Evil. Everybody was on this kick. Oh, we got to see it open mat. We got to see it 137. That's his preferred aspect ratio. Yeah, based on what? Who said that? Who said that? I can't find a quote from Orson Welles saying, "Yes, well, of course I shot that for 137. Everybody knows that." It doesn't make sense. And then it's even more comical when you have the folks that are talking about this stuff. Well, we got to see this 137 because that's the way Stanley Kubrick intended it. Oh yeah, guess what? Run it 137. Half the film's hard matted. Uh-oh.
I saw
mean-
2001 and 137 on TV once. That
Ugh.
was the funniest thing I have ever seen. It was in the middle of the night, and I thought I dreamt it the next day.
Well, I think a lot of people are freaked out about this idea too because of pan and scan. And pan and scan, for those of you who are too young to remember, back in the old 4x3 days on television, they'd take a CinemaScope image and just lop off the sides just to fill the screen.
Center
And
cut.
it was called pan and scan because when stuff happened on the screen, this poor operator had to go meh, and move the optical printer one way so you saw somebody talking on the other side. And then when somebody on the other side of the screen started talking, he'd go meh. And it was an atrocious way of watching a movie.
Mhm.
But because people just don't want their screens not being filled, they had to do it that way.
Well, the other thing you run up against, and I totally get that as someone who grew up, loving movies and seeing these films on television in the 60s, late 60s, 1970s. Of course, they were all shown full frame, open matte. So you've got the nostalgia factor with a company that's going to put out, I don't know, let's pick a title, The Giant Claw or some, horror film that has a strong fan base. Well, they saw it on TV full frame, and that's how they want to see it now on DVD or Blu-ray. So we've had to make the argument, well, that's not what the filmmaker intended. So if you had to make a choice of presenting it optimally as the director and DP wanted you to see it, you go with the theatrical ratio. But Criterion kind of set a new standard when they did On the Waterfront, because they did it 137, 166, and 185. All three ratios in one disc, which is fine. It gives people an option. I mean, I call
it the Burger King mentality of aspect ratios. Have it your way.
So some distributors have started, and that's fine. And if as long as it doesn't compromise the bit rate, go for it. Be my guest. But that there was a lot of opposition. You talk about Magnificent Obsession, and I remember when that whole storm hit the various internet forums. One of the arguments that people were making about 137 being correct for that film is, Jane Wyman's in the hospital towards the end of the movie, and there's these medium close-up shots of her in the hospital bed with a mile of just open space above her. And you crop it to 2:1, and all of a sudden it looks like a well-composed shot. But they were making the argument that, well, the empty space is representing her character's isolation and depression. And oh my God.
Too much postmodernistic takes on this stuff,
So, Bob, what other movies have you guys run into where you've had like a little bit of issue determining aspect ratio?
Hey, last night at the Film Forum in New York City, we ran our restoration of Gog, the Herbert L. Strock science fiction title from 1954, and photographed in natural vision. And natural vision, about a month before production, had modified the viewfinders to allow the cinematographer to see the different marks for aspect ratios. And they used a colored kind of filter for that, so they could see and compose for what the director intended. And every piece of documentation we had for GOG said 185:1. And again, the titles fall into place beautifully at 185. The moment the action starts, 185 is too tight. Everything's clipped in the medium shots. Again, the long shots are not going to give you that information because there's a lot of room. The close-ups, they're a little misleading because you may get a close-up in 137 that's composed to see the full head, but when you crop it to the widescreen it was intended, you're zooming in, you're getting a little more dramatic, and really zooming in on the eyes and the facial expressions. But it's the medium shots that will give you the answer. And if everyone's getting their heads clipped in the medium shot in 185, then it was too tight. So we pulled that back to 1:6:6:1. And just like the glass web, it fell into place beautifully. All of a sudden, the camera is tilting on certain shots. There's a scene where Richard Egan lights this little note on fire, and the camera tilts down to show him, light the flame on the paper. And you could tell at that point, 1:6:6 is what they were intended. So that's what you go by, and that's what we did on the master.
Another forensic too that we use, and again, it's a combination of all these things. It's never just one thing. If we went by the titles, that would be wrong. But another forensic piece is where they place the changeover cue, because the projectionist has to see the changeover cue entirely.
Oh, right.
In the old Academy days, it's going to be way up in the corner. If it's 1:6:6:1, it usually falls on the 1:6:6 line. If it's 1:85, it usually falls on the 1:85 line. Again, not always. We've seen half-cropped, changeover cues, but that gives us at least another indication of what the intention is.
Yeah, I never even thought of that.
I
That's
never
a great,
even thought of that either.
That's a great,
Yeah.
way to look at it, because obviously that information has to be there.
Absolutely.
Do
You
your
don't
job.
want to clone changeover.
Yeah. Otherwise, there's no way you could do it. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no one size fits all magic formula. I think it's essential to know what the studio policy was at time of production, and see what the exhibitors information the exhibitors were given, and then make sure you've got that full negative or element scan, so you're getting the full width of it. Do a center crop and see where it lands. And there were a few cases with movies that had been in the can when the transition took place in theaters in mid-1953, where they would actually went in and configured the opening titles with a higher crop to the image. And we've never found the documentation, but I imagine there had to be something, that went out with the print to theaters saying compose for 1:6:6 or 1:7:5 on the main titles. And then that's favoring the upper part of the frame versus the middle or lower. So that
Columbia
way,
was notorious for that. Columbia was the one that did that the most.
Exactly.
Like two examples I can think of right off the bat are So This Is Love and The Big Heat. You watch the opening titles on those. They're correctly shown 137 now in their home video editions. But watch them and then look at how ridiculous the title is. Sits just floating above dead space on the bottom of it, with the idea that the projectionist is going to rack the framing on those titles and then just, basically crop it from the top down rather than a center crop.
And two, to talk about the point Jack made earlier about theaters, if you think about the theaters that these movies were shown in 7 decades ago, some of these were enormous 4,000 seat houses where you had an incredible keystone because of the, a projection booth that's 180 feet from the screen, and you've got this incredible pitch of the image, and they're trying to compensate for that by how they file out the aspect ratio plates in the projector. There had to be a little bit of flexibility because there was no way to lock that into, say, 1:8:5:1, and that's, as Jack said, why 2:1 became more common than most people realize as a standard ratio for most theaters.
And we actually just cut a new plate that was trapezoidal down at Village East for The Brutalist, because that projector is so high up in the balcony. I mean, the theater was built as a live theater originally, and they changed it to a movie house in the 30s, so that booth's an add-on. But we have a crazy keystone there. So you manage that by, there's an aperture plate in the projector gate that sort of gives you that crisp edge. And so when you cut that, you have to cut it at an angle like that. That sort of rectifies the image on the screen to have straight lines straight down.
So, Jack, as a projectionist, are you excited about this kind of return to film and actual film projection?
I am. I am very interested in especially the 70 millimeter stuff. There's been very few of the revival 70 millimeter titles that I haven't run at this point. I've got some reservations about how some things have been done, but they're technical nitpicks. And I know this is a technical podcast, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. My biggest complaint, if I could beg Kodak, bring back acetate 70 millimeter. They're printing everything on polyester now, and it's just the worst format. It scratches if you look at it the wrong way. It gets static cling that clings to itself. It curls. It doesn't like swift weather changes. I mean, there's a million things I could list about polyester 70 that I don't like. But, other than that, how's the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Well, it's funny. You think about all the people that came together to, create these works of art, and how really it all boils down to the quality of the projection and what happens in the theaters. And Jack, I don't remember if you were at this show with me or not, but I remember we went to see the 10 Commandments.
Oh,
in,
yeah.
In this beautiful 1920s movie house, great place to see a movie. And they're running it in 35 millimeter. I think it was even a dye transfer Technicolor print.
It was original 1956 print.
Okay. Looked great, except the man in the booth was a little sloppy. And I remember the great scene where Moses is parting the Red Sea, and he's framed in the upper portion of the image, and he's holding up the staff. You couldn't see him. He started from the waist down. The whole top of the image was missing.
That guy
Are
was
you sure you didn't see the Super VistaVision?
It was.
Oh, no. This was an original print.
Okay, I was just making sure that it wasn't that re-release in the 90s that they did.
No. This was a 1956 dye transfer print. This guy was just asleep at the wheel.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
He wasn't using the framing tree. Every reel started seemingly in a different framing position. I don't even know how you do that. You have to be messing with the frame knob in between reels to do that.
Was it after a 3 martini lunch, maybe?
Perhaps.
No. This was. I knew who it was. I'm not going to out him on this podcast.
Yeah.
But this was just good old-fashioned carelessness.
That's so funny. Do you want to talk about that Super VistaVision at all?
No.
No, please. I think actually that's an interesting issue of the film. You should talk about that.
I mean, I don't know what to say about it other than they re-released it in the 90s with this Super VistaVision thing in the wrong aspect ratio.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2-1, wasn't it?
They cropped it all down. Yeah.
I mean, what's this to say more than that?
Well, I mean, we're talking aspect ratios, and this is a prime example of how you can ruin the enjoyment of a film by overcropping
If I can interject, actually, this is an interesting part that sort of segues from that. In the late 60s, MGM's big moneymaker, of course, still was Gone with the Wind. They reissued it countlessly. And that film had an interesting widescreen release because they reissued it in 1954. And at that time, MGM's house ratio was 1.75 to 1. But they realized some shots in the film weren't going to jive at that aspect ratio. So I can't believe that they did this, but they did. It's sacrilege. They physically cut the camera negative with new optically recentered shots for those shots, like 5 shots in the film. And they forever mangled the camera negative in doing that. Then, to add insult to injury, in the late 60s, they decided, well, you know what? We now got widescreen, we got stereophonic sound, we're going to do Gone with the Wind in 70 millimeter. So you're taking a 137 to 1 film and now cropping it down to 2.2 to 1. You're basically cutting it in half. And reframed it, remixed it for sound, stereo sound and everything. And guess what? It was the most successful reissue of the film that they did. So,
Of course it was, right?
of course.
You know, looking at the documentation in 1953, I think the studios were at least trying to be proactive with these 200 or so titles that were shot before the transition, to do as little harm to the visual compositions as possible. And I know somewhere I saw a reference to War of the Worlds, because George Powell had shot that in 1952, clearly for Academy ratio. Uh, it premiered in England first, and then by the time it premiered in the US, I think in the fall of 1953, most theaters were going to run it widescreen. And there was a reference, I think, in Variety to, Paramount optically adjusting some of the shots in the film to make them work in the 1:6 ratio. There's things with, I remember when Warner Brothers was recommending ratios for their standard 1:37 films. House of Wax, the 3D film, it was another Academy ratio production. But for any theater running it widescreen, they recommended was like 1:60 or some weird
Yeah, cut a new
ratio.
plate, make it
Yeah,
difficult for the projectionist.
yeah.
And then on top of it, he's got to do it twice because it's a 3D presentation.
Yeah.
That's no fun.
How many times did that actually happen? I doubt
Never.
very
And
much.
that's the thing too, is most people don't realize it really doesn't matter what it was shown at in the theater, because it was going to change from screen to screen anyway. They're going to run it whatever their flat ratio is at that house. So if that's 1:85, it doesn't matter. Most of these places didn't break out new lenses and aperture plates. They just ran it the way that they had it. They had two lens sets, a scope and a flat, and they ran it flat, whatever the aspect ratio was of that house. I mean,
I
it's
know.
in cases of like deluxe theaters in big cities, sure, you might have different lens sets and different aperture plates cut for special occasions for this sort of stuff. And I mean, we still do that today.
Well, one of the other things that we met a lot of opposition with was the theory that the transition to widescreen in 1953 was a very gradual thing that took years to happen. And it was exactly the opposite case. By the end of the year, Box Office published a survey that showed that I think something like 80% of the downtown theaters had converted to widescreen. And it was a little less in the smaller towns and neighborhood houses. But the point was, once a theater converted, they were no longer showing films in the standard ratio, because the whole idea was get away from television and make the screen bigger and give the audience the biggest image you possibly can. So they weren't going back to standard ratio. So by 1954, newsreels, shorts, cartoons were all composed primarily for widescreen exhibition. And we have a quote from Myrtle Chamberlain, who was the head of technical operations at MGM in late 1954. And he said that the general consensus among all the distributors and exhibitors is that the standard ratio is gone. Widescreen is here to stay.
And
And
specifically 1:85 is
well,
the way we're going now.
yeah, it took until really 1956, so about a little more than 3 years into it, for everybody to finally get on the same page and go with 1:85 as the standard non-anamorphic ratio. In the US, in the UK, their conversion to widescreen was pretty complete as well by the end of 1953. They had settled on 1:75 to 1 by 1955. So at least it got to some sense of normalcy, because you can imagine the poor exhibitor and operator, trying to navigate this minefield of ratios and aperture plates. It was like the Wild West.
Well, hey, thanks so much, guys, for coming on. This has been great. Bob, what does the 3D Film Archive have in store for us coming up?
Well, you may not have noticed, but we're working on a movie called Money from Home.
I couldn't tell from your background there. Not at all.
Yeah, very subtle. It's a complex restoration, and I'll let Jack explain a wee bit about the technical challenges to it. But it's going to be, I say, one of the best looking, if not the best vintage 3D title on Blu-ray. And it's still a little bit too early to give a definite release date, but we're working really hard to get that finished by the spring of this year. And it's going to look amazing. And Jack, do you want to touch a little bit about the technical challenges on Money from Home?
Well, Money from Home was shot with a very special camera system. For photographing stereoscopic films, you have to have two cameras, where the lenses are about the distance of your eyes. And usually, up until the point where they shot Money from Home, it was done with a couple cameras, usually on black and white or Eastman color stock. Technicolor, which historically has always been run by madmen, decided we're going to take our 3-strip cameras, and for those of you who don't know what that is, Technicolor was the first practical color system in Hollywood, where they photographed red, green, and blue light using 3 separate strips of film in the same camera. They figured, well, let's just stack 2 3-strip cameras together and we'll shoot 6 strips of film at once, stereoscopically. So we've had to actually recombine the red, green, and blue elements on both eyes, 6 strips of film at once. So all the work that you're doing twice over. And recombining that in the digital realm now gives us a lot more flexibility than you could have back in the photochemical days. But you have to remember, this is a 70-plus-year-old film at this point, and there's shrinkage issues and all these other things. And we've literally had to realign the color separation shot by shot. And that's 6 reel films, so it's, what was that, Bob? About 110 minutes, 100 minutes or so?
Yeah, just about, I think 106 or something.
Yeah,
It's a long one.
Multiply that by 2. And
Yeah, you guys are the only crazy people that would ever take that on.
somebody's got to do it.
Well, we were very fortunate because we had some wonderful people that saw to it that we got the best scans from. You can't get much better than Camera Negative and Technicolor Camera Negative. It's. I remember when Jack put together the first couple of shots, and I looked at it, and my jaw dropped. Now, I used to have, as part of the archive, a 35 millimeter dye transfer left-right pair, and I thought that looked stunning, and it did. But you look at what this new scan looks like. Oh my goodness! I mean,
It looks like it was shot yesterday.
It's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. The detail, and really, it's not grainy at all. You would think with all of that, stock and coming together, really, really well photographed. I know when I talked to Jerry Lewis about it, his primary memory of the film was how hot the set was, because obviously for Technicolor, you had to hit with a lot of extra light.
Yeah,
And
during that time.
And then
my
double
goodness.
that with 2 cameras. You got to get the exposure for both of those, because now one of them's shooting through a mirror, so you're cutting the light there.
Wow.
Yeah. And his quote was, he was amazed that Daniel Fapp was able to control the exposure because of just how much light they had on set. And you can see it. I mean, there are shots where it looks like Dean's hair is wet. That could have been the pomade too, but
it's probably melting on his head.
But yeah, it's stunning, and it's conservatively shot. It's not. By that I mean it's not gimmicky like people think, like it's not a Three Stooges short where they're throwing chairs and bats and all sorts of things. There are a couple good off-screen effects that are integrated into the gags, but it's just a really beautifully composed 3D movie. And by the time it came out in theaters in 1954, most theaters opted to show it flat. I think something like only 8% of theatrical playdates ran it in 3D. So this Blu-ray is pretty much going to be like the world 3D premiere. So that's very exciting for all of us.
You gotta get me out of here. There's lady girls in here undressed.
Inside. His exalted worthiness desires a wife. Enter. Spirited. You're the one I choose. The rest go. Go, go! Your shyness is charming. But before you reveal yourself to me, you must dance again. By the degree of your grace, let me surmise your identity. Faster! 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 That's enough, my spirited one! Now, my fragrant flower, come to me. Come. Then I come to you. Come. Come here, little one, come here. Yes, I'm going to teach you. So exciting. You will be among my favorites.
Well, Money from Home sounds like it's going to be spectacular. I can't wait to see that one. And again, I just can't thank you guys enough. Your knowledge base is incredible. We always learn from you every time we talk.
I know. I learned something new this time about aspect ratios and prints. Didn't even think about checking those. So thanks so much for coming on and chatting with us about this topic, which sounds boring, but is anything but. So thanks again.
I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much, both of you. Really enjoyed this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you. Bye.
So there we have it. Aspect ratios. That was a rad conversation.
It was. It actually was a lot more interesting than I thought it would.
I know. I had a lot of questions that we never even got to.
Yeah, I know you had this massive list.
Giant list.
Yeah.
Didn't even need it.
Yep.
Why did I even prepare? No, it was a great time. So a couple things. Well, I mean, I did prepare for this, and now I'm forgetting. No. The Glass Web, that's coming out soon.
From Kino Lorber and
Kino
the 3D
Lorber,
Film
definitely
Archive.
check that out. Of course, Money from Home. We don't have a date on that yet, but we'll watch this space. Maybe we'll do an episode on Money from Home. I think we
probably will.
Because maybe there's some more people involved with that restoration. I don't know. What do you think?
I think I know one that is involved with that restoration.
Yeah,
So
I don't know. So, yeah, that would be great. Maybe we'll expand the Country Girl. I don't know. We didn't really chat about that too much. So
I think
that could be
there's a
good
conversation, like
Yeah.
maybe like a little perf mini on that
yeah,
one.
we could
You know,
do. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of teases here. But anyways, we'll also link to all the information that we teased about that Bob put about the aspect ratios and Jack. So we will have that in the show notes. We'll also put a little the website.
Yeah, we'll put the
address
URL address
you
up.
know,
So
if somebody wants to pause and copy that.
Like,
But
yeah,
we'll
just
put
type
it
it
in.
in.
The show notes. We'll put it in the show notes. So we'll do that. So thanks again to 3D Archive, to Kino Lorber. Who else? Did we have other
Asta and
people?
Ripley, they didn't appear in this one.
Not
so,
at all. It was,
yeah, but we'll thank them anyway.
yeah, thanks
You know?
for
Good moral support. Thanks for actually staying out of this episode.
Yeah, thanks for staying out of
Because
the
they kind of
way.
make it a little harder sometimes. You're juggling the dog and trying to
They are.
look at your notes.
Thanks for staying out of the way. All right. Well,
So until next time, thanks for joining us here
on
at Perf Damage.
It's
Fuck,
on
why do I say
Perf
at?
Damage.
Yeah.
I don't know. Where is it?
On
On
Perf
Perf
Damage.
Damage.
Well, you can do it like that.
I know.
On Perf Damage. Yeah, and so that kind of brings up, you were talking about oh shit, I had a good transition there. Damn it. I totally lost it.
Changeover cues?
Yeah.
Hard mats? Aspect
Wow.
ratios of the screens at the
Oh yes, yeah, that's what so sorry.
The topic of the conversation.
Right.